Hello, friends. Welcome to the last panel, the final panel in our 2023 Indie Animation How To series. Today we will be covering post production and pipeline management with four esteemed guests. The individual previously known as Evan is no longer able to join us tonight, so everybody send well wishes to Startius, creator of Looming the Great Big Galaxy, and let's give a warm welcome to our four panelists today. We've got Abraham, who created Among the Others. We've got Ben from the studio Adventure Noises. We've got Maud from Capapon Studios. And we've got Eddie, creator of Circus of Wishes. So we're going to go ahead and do some intros. Abraham, tell us about yourself.
Hey, I'm Abraham. As Keeks mentioned, I am the creator of Among the Others. We're currently working on putting together a little prologue season for our show, and I'm excited to talk to you guys about my experience in the pipeline and all that jazz, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm doing all right. Like Kiki said, my name is Ben. I'm a WGA writer and the studio lead at Adventure Noises. Our show they work on is Marabelli Scoundrel's Tale, oceanic adventure about the absolute worst man in all of human history trying to help some children and failing miserably. Um, we've probably mentioned this before, but we run a full service animation studio that works in production, writing, and creative development. And yeah, no, we're just excited to be talking about pre-production, sort of like how people can get things, started for their projects and how to keep things organized. And it's going to be a good day today.
Hey, I'm Maud. I go by Monolith Online, and I am the co-creator of Capapon Studios, also directing and running the proof of concepts for the series Hearts of Titan. It is pretty fun. Also, I don't know. I'm really obsessed with Baldur's Gate. I've already said that last panel. I'm still thinking about it.
Oh wait, one
Same.
cool fact about us. Shit. I sword fight.
Awesome. Sword fighting is awesome.
Hi, my name is Eddie, Edmead Art, basically everywhere. I am a storyboard artist by trade. That's my full-time job. And I'm also the creator, director, and storyboard artist and writer of Circus of Wishes, which is a 2D animated indie musical film that's currently in pre-production. We're working on boarding. We have four original musical numbers that I'm so excited to share with people soon. It's about a 15-year-old girl that is super ambitious, and she wants to be a star and to do all these exciting things in entertainment. And she stumbles across this magical circus, and shenanigans ensue. And I'm excited to talk to people a little bit about what I'm doing for keeping organized and funding pre crowdfunding and all that stuff. So I'm excited to be at this panel today. Mhm.
All right, thank you everybody for your intros. And now we're going to dive into our first topic. So, if you were here for our first panel on pre production, we began by defining what exactly pre production is. So, today we're going to do the same thing, and we're going to spend, up to 10 minutes or so talking about what exactly is post production, what activities can fall under post production. And I think for this one, we'll have each of you kind of give your own definition, and then we can switch to a discussion for a little bit. So, Ben, do you want to tell us first what you think post production is?
Oh God, I guess I'm starting with this. Basically, it's just the final polishes on a lot of what you're trying to do, like with a project. It's really the last chance you get to get the final look of the show done. A big thing you're going to be want to focus on are things like compositing and editing for things like lighting effects or general like effects work overall. This is where you want to be refining and tuning up everything you've been working on because as you've been animating, you've probably been working from a scratch track, having basically the audio from your voiceover artist you've been working with, maybe some initial effects, making sure everything is balanced. it's really just the culmination of everything you need to bring together to get it to be what it's going to look like as you get out.
Awesome. Yeah, I would say very similarly. It's sort of the part of the pipeline where once you've gotten everything you needed done in production, it's the time for you to sort of collect all of those assets and start to glue them together somehow, whether that is via, sort of as Ben mentioned, compositing or sound design and final touches up on editing and so on and so forth. So yeah, it's basically your final glue so that you can finally package it up and get it ready for people to see.
Yeah, so I actually worked in compositing on a few indie productions in the past, and usually how I define post-production, when people say pre-production, usually that means pre-animation, so storyboarding, character design, viz dev, and stuff like that. Production usually means the animation itself, so actually doing the animating. And post-production, I usually try to define as like post-animation. So the animation is done, but things like compositing, adding effects, that can plus the animation. And I call it like my job as a compositor when I was doing it is making the animation look prettier. So it was like lighting and effects, animation, and shading and stuff like that. And beyond compositing, of course, there's always sound design and all of those final polish things that come after the actual animation part of the process. So I think sometimes when I've chatted with people, they get a little confused on the production thing because sometimes they think it means post production, as in the project is over, but really it kind of means post animation, at least in my definition of it.
Yeah, so I think everyone else did a pretty good job of defining it. Similar to Eddie, I have experience in compositing. That's what I work most of the time in. And one of the main things that I have experience with post-production is a lot of the time it's problem solving and a lot of troubleshooting. So when you have all of the assets and everything put together, um, there's a lot of things that can happen where you might have to call things out and like fix things or rearrange things. It's a lot of timing. It's a lot of like effects building, and of course like editing everything together. But definitely, I think it comes down to like spotting out like continuity consistencies and anything that you want to sort of touch up or go back and fix. It can be a real back and forth with like the post production team as well as other departments. But overall, it's my personal favorite of the pipeline. I like it.
Sweet. Okay. Is there anything else that you guys want to talk about, just generally, your thoughts on post production before we dive into specific topics?
Go ahead, Eddie.
Oh, okay. I was just gonna say, just super quick, something that I've noticed a lot. I noticed this also with student films as well as indie animation. I think more often than not, I think that post production is pretty overlooked. I think people will, they'll finish the animation and they're like, oh, ready to go. And there is so much of post production that is equally important as storyboarding or the animation itself. I think that doing compositing or editing or sound design can really elevate your project. And I think that people often overlook it. So I think it's an important thing to learn a little bit more about and give it the time that it needs. I've been on a few films where there would be allotted maybe 1 week for post production because it was just not really given the same sort of equal respect, I think. So I encourage people to learn a little bit more about it. And if they're doing an indie project, to consider giving a little bit more time to compositing or refining their work because it can really make a big difference.
Yeah, it's not just slapping a room light on it.
Yeah. Like I would add to that and say that it's don't let the name mislead you. Post production should be planned for as early as pre production sometimes, right? So that goes for as far as sort of how do you want to style this once everything comes down to compositing. how is the sound design going to emphasize the elements of your storyboards, for example, and stuff like that. So for us on our show, post-production is something that we plan for during our shot list meetings before production start as well. So all these things are planned for ahead of time.
All right, so with our definitions established, let's dive into the traditional animation pipeline versus the indie animation pipeline. I'll let any of you guys take the floor. Hopefully, we can kind of collaborate here on defining what are the steps of the indie animation process. What is the pipeline, and how does that differ when you are running your project independently?
I'm curious from those of you guys, I think Maud and Eddie and maybe Ben, I think, though I'm less familiar with their experience, but like you guys have spent some time in the studio world. I feel like it might be good to hear your perspective first on the traditional side of things, how things usually work.
Yeah. I guess like it's kind of weird because I started off in indie first. Like that's kind of like
Mhm.
how I got my footing, and then of course I
Mhm.
moved into the industry, and most of my experience does come like from working on shows at this point. But honestly, when I first started working in indie, it was just me and three other friends, and we didn't have any experience. Like we did not know how the pipeline really worked until we actually over time worked together and built up experience. So the first
Mhm.
few projects that we ever worked on was us just learning how to communicate strongly with one another and knowing what our skill suits were and how to complement each other with our skills because it was just four people, and that's how we kind of developed and sort of crafted what we now specialize in. So a lot of it was like at the first definitely guesswork, but definitely needed very very strong communication with one another. In contrast to how the industry pipeline works, very, very structured, very, very organized. Everyone has a role. There's a reason for every single single thing. It's very meticulous. Of course, I can't divulge like everything behind the scenes from the productions that I've worked on,
Mhm.
but there's so many moving parts, and it's very, very organized and structured and intentional.
Mhm.
Yeah, and that intention helps a lot in basically how you want to have the process go. Because the one thing that's really nice about obviously an indie pipeline is you do have a bit more flexibility. And since you're just working either entirely by yourself or with a small team, you can sort of just tackle things as you do. But the way that at least we approach this, like with Adventure Noises, is we sort of try to take some cues from sort of the studio model and adapt it to basically how it works for like our time frames and how we kind of divvy up and separate work. But we, in terms of just talking about kind of what goes into it, do we just want to all start from the beginning? Because Maud made an excellent point. Like before anything else, figuring out sort of what the team is going to be handling, each person kind of like what they want to tackle, and just sort of figuring out roles is a part of pre-production. Being able to
Yeah.
sort of organize what your workflow is going to be.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Have a
And
script.
bef-
That's pre-production, I guess is the first thing.
Yeah. Before we I think before we jump into like the actual process of kind of where
Yeah,
we
yeah.
start, I just want to touch briefly on my experience in the traditional pipeline so that we can kind of
Mhm.
compare and contrast indie versus
Yeah.
traditional.
Yeah.
Right.
But yes, I definitely think we should definitely lead into that because I think there's pre-production kind of what you said.
Yeah.
um but just very briefly, so I worked at Warner Brothers for a little bit over a year as a storyboard revisionist. So I did have experience working in the traditional studio environment. I think that a significant difference between traditional and indie is traditional studios, you have one job to do. You have one thing that you do, and you go down the line of who's in charge of what. So I had a director, and then I had a supervising story director, and then I had a supervising director, and a producer, and a line producer. And all these people had jobs that they had to do. But then once you get into indie, there's a lot of limits to our funding. And so oftentimes your director is your producer and your line producer and all of these things wrapped into one. So I think that indie is a little bit more scrappy on who takes on what roles. I think usually because of funding limitations.
Mhm.
My experience of indie versus traditional is I actually found that I had a lot more creative say working on indie productions than I did in a studio. Because a studio wants a certain thing. They're like, we're making this specific thing for this specific studio with this specific story. You just got to do the work. And it's like, okay, cool. That's my job. But with indie, I felt like I was able to give input as a story artist when I was doing storyboards. And because it's a smaller team, it is much more collaborative, at least in my experience. So I think those were two significant differences that I noticed. Is it's a lot more structured in the studio environment, and it's a well-oiled machine for a reason. But I think that indie doesn't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel, but if you only have a limited amount of people, oftentimes your voice will be heard a little bit more, and the director will have to take on a few additional roles to keep things rolling. So that's just my 2 cents, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to sort of echo that as well, particularly the portion about in indie you have to wear a lot of hats. It's just the name of the game. It's the nature of the fact that budgets are smaller. I think when comparing our productions to traditional studios, you'll definitely find that like one role tends to encompass many more roles than that's not sort of written in the job description. So, for example, if an indie team is hiring for a production manager, it might mean a lot more than a production manager. If they're hiring for a character designer, it might mean a lot more than a character designer sometimes and such. And those are things that sort of influence your pipeline in different ways depending on how your team dynamic shapes up. For example, it might mean that your communication process is a little bit more impromptu versus having structured meetings and such. Or you might be, for example, in my production, there's sort of a requirement to be self-sufficient with what tasks to take on and such. Whereas in traditional pipelines, most people expect to have their work assigned to them directly and such. So there's self-sufficiencies and those sorts of things that need to be considered in indie more often than in traditional, from my understanding. So
Yeah.
I can say, before like any indie production starts, it's very important to also just do the research on how the traditional pipeline works and how studios do that, so you know how to basically make your own. And of course, like it's going to be a smaller team. There's going to be less resources. So knowing how the pipeline works helps you to know what you should change or expedite depending on what resources you have access to.
Yeah, like if you have someone who's going to be doing every single part of post-production, you're probably going to need to adjust what your schedule is, because if you have multiple people, it can go a bit smooth. You can divvy things up, but it's going to impact what your final schedule and what you're able to actually do at a time is going to be.
Right. Yeah. Be educated. That's good. I'll keep you moving faster.
Yeah, because the whole
The more.
reason we study it is because, not for nothing, there's a reason why that process is used and why you don't jump directly into animation before doing your storyboards, and why you don't do picture lock until you've actually figured out what your final aesthetic is going to be for like final comps. Like there's a reason, and it prevents you from basically doing a bunch of wasted work or having to backtrack constantly. So Mod is absolutely correct, and study up, make
Yeah.
sure you understand this too, and that's what we're going to be going over a lot of today.
Definitely.
Yeah, and one of the great things about working in indie is that, especially if you are, staying up to date with what's going on in the industry, what are the best practices, what are the traditions that people are abiding by, and why do people structure their companies the way they do, their studios the way that they do. You suddenly will have the ability to now reshape all that to your liking, and that gives you sort of this flexibility and nimbleness to restructure your pipeline in ways that most studios can't, because their infrastructure tends to be more ingrained in their entire company's process. So for your indie projects, I think like if we wanted, I'm going to make a really bad example, but like if we wanted with pre-production to last, 2 centuries and then production to last one day, you could do that. I wouldn't advise it, but you have the option to sort of shape the dynamic of your pipeline according to what your project's needs are. And so, but you can't really do that if you're not aware of what the standards are, right? Kind of like you got to know the rules before you can break them, kind of situation.
Pre-production, 2 centuries. Production, 1 year.
One day.
Post, what can you get me in 5 minutes?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that I mean, with traditional studios, there's a reason why the productions work like that. There's a reason why things go in a certain order because that's how it works. It doesn't mean that you can't sort of make your own spin on it if there's something that works better for you. But usually, if you start storyboarding before your script is done, you're just wasting yourself a lot of time.
Right.
So
Right.
researching how studios do it and is not necessarily a bad thing. You just might have to downscale it for the size of your project.
Yeah, and guys,
Exactly,
feel
yeah.
free to also throw questions like in the chat. We are looking through this as we're going. We'd love to hear like what you guys are trying to figure out as well.
Yeah.
I wanted to add on before we move on, that in contrast to traditional indie, I think understanding scope is really important because for
God.
industry, you're making like a season, like a full blown like animated season.
Mhm.
For indie, it can be anything. Like you could be making anything. It could be a film, it could be a proof of concept, it could be a pilot, it could be like again a full blown series depending on what your scope is. But for indie, there's no rules to it. You could be producing whatever you are interested in. But that does come with the knowledge that you need to understand how the pipeline works and again know how to break those rules. So like do you have an accessibility to like a team of like 50 to 100 people to make a show? Or is it just you and your friends? Okay, if it's a smaller team, maybe just to scale it down to make it easier and more possible to complete something like that of that size and that length, you might want to make it smaller. Or like what kind of resources do you have? A budget? Can you pay people? Okay, if not, how are you going about that? It really depends on like what your goals are and what your scope of the project is and what resources you have.
Absolutely. I think to kind of bounce off of your point, Maud, I think very often when we say like kind of look at what the studios are doing and adjust it for yourself, people are like, oh, okay, so I'll make a whole season, which you can do that. Go for it. But if you are the leader of a project, right? If you're the creator, the director, and it's your responsibility to keep people on track, how are you budgeting your time? How are you budgeting your finances? How are you budgeting the amount of work that is going to go into it? And making sure that you have a reasonable idea of scope and what you're capable of with the team that you can afford and the team that you have available to you is really important to do before you even start writing, before you even start the project itself. Taking a long realistic sit down with yourself and being like, okay, what is the scope that I am capable of? I think that's very important for people to evaluate if you're going to be because you're a project leader. If you're the director or the creator, you are leading a group of people, and if you bite off more than you can chew, that's going to have a ripple effect down the line. So definitely agree with what you said, Maud.
Yeah, know your stuff, guys.
Yeah.
Do we want to jump into the like what the actual process? Because in what you said, in terms of figuring out your budget, line producing is the thing.
Yes.
The sexiest part of every production is figuring out the budget. Ooh,
Yeah. The scary budget.
the scary, scary budget.
Mm-hmm.
Do you guys want to jump into?
Yeah. Well, whatever you got next for us.
Oh, is it actually? Nice.
Awesome. Alrighty.
So
Yeah, I mean,
coincidentally, we had a slide for budgeting specifically. So let's dive into that process and what you guys have learned and what your strategies are there.
know how much you're willing to spend as early as possible. and budget 20 to 30% extra just in case. I think in indie animation, and probably in any production, and just in any creative endeavor in general, you're gonna need to account for rainy day funds. It's just something that happens a lot. Especially in indie animation, I think there's a lot of shifting elements, a lot of unexpected things that happen, a lot of planning that happens that you didn't foresee to become problems because you don't have the luxury of decades of infrastructure in place to educate you on that sometimes. That maybe your executive producers might have had, for example, at a bigger studio, right? That have guided you out of that. And so the definitely account for your funds like 20 to 30% extra, if not even more, as a just in case measure. That's first step. I think for me is just like know your funds and know how much is going to be your rainy day funds.
And in terms of actually figuring out like what that actually means,
Mhm.
practical thing you can do, just make honestly like a Google spreadsheet and figure out, okay, so a good rule of thumb. You've written your script, right? I really hope you did before you're doing any of this. Please have a script, for the love of God. The amount of people that actually go into this without even having a script written is genuinely surprising to me sometimes.
Yeah.
You have your script, and then approximately each page of a script is about 1 minute of animation, is a good rule of thumb in general to just kind of follow. And then the way that we normally think of it is 15 to 20 storyboard panels can be about like a page of a script. And there's variations to that, but it's a good, like, safe estimate. Figure out if you have a 30-page script and you're going to be doing around 15 to 20 storyboards for each page of your script that you have. What is the amount of money you need to budget working with artists? Or if you're doing it yourself, what is the time that you need to set aside to be able to get this done? How detailed do you want it to be? Is it enough for you to just have thumbs, which is basically just like really brief sketches that aren't incredibly detailed, but they're more just to get like a person's positioning, blocking in a shot more so than detail for the characters. It's like very simple. Or do you want it more detailed? And that's a question, because if you have more detail in the boards, that makes it easier for the animation section. But on a very simple place, if you're working with folks and you're working with other artists and you're working with a larger team, make sure that you understand what is the work that goes into making the thing that you are trying to create. And those metrics are going to be a good rule of thumb for you in terms of how you want to separate and divvy.
Sure. I think even in regards to sort of even scripts and stuff like that, like you might be the type of creator who is more interested in developing your characters and you're not quite ready for a script yet and such. In that case, you have to budget for writers in that sense too, right? So regardless of where you are in your process, I think the best thing to do is look at what your ultimate goal is and then go on something like Glassdoor or go on I don't know, all these other hiring websites out there that show you sort of salaries and such. Take a look at what's the industry standards. I know, for example, union rates are also public. Those are things that you can check out and such, and make your estimates roughly based on that and based on what you're able to afford. And start talking to people as well. Start talking to artists. Start talking to writers if that's the kind of creator you are. Composers, whomever, and start asking around on what kind of rates that they're willing to work within. Start off somewhere around like half of what industry standard would be, and then go up from there, and then see what people start to respond to, and that'll give you an idea of what numbers to associate with all the things that Ben was mentioning. Things like the number of boards, the level of detail, the number of pages that you're willing to work it within in the script and such. You'll be able to start to associate numbers now to those from there.
Yeah, and don't be bashful to ask people and to like send those emails out or those like Twitter DMs. Like people appreciate the fact that you actually are trying to meet them where they
Yeah.
are. And if you're able to let someone know what is it that you would like for this role, and if you can't do that, then okay, you don't waste their time, you don't waste your time, and you try to figure out what's going to work for you. But no one's going to be mad about you asking. No one's going to look and be
Right.
like, oh, look at this guy unprofessionally asking what a fair wage for my work is.
Right.
What a punk. Like, no.
Right.
People appreciate that. So don't feel bashful about doing it, and it'll allow you to actually get that learning.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah.
I think
Sorry, go ahead, Abraham.
no. I just want to say it's a good thing to communicate to people, and they will be appreciative of it. But I have another point to that, but Eddie, I don't want to interrupt you, so say that first. Say yours
No,
first.
no, you finish your thoughts, and then I'll
Okay,
jump
okay.
in.
All right.
So good.
I guess my one point is, though, just to be sort of careful with sort of your sample size, I guess. If we're talking statistics here, when you're reaching out to people, I mean, for those of you who are watching, I would sort of wouldn't be surprised if a big chunk of any of us, even people here, would have questions around how much you would want to get paid for certain roles, especially if you've never done that before. I think, obviously for those of us who have done certain tasks and responsibilities before, we have an idea of the cost of that. But if somebody reaches out to us for a role that we haven't done before, we might not know, right? So ask more than just one person. Reach out to a lot of people, get a proper sample size, and you'll start to figure out the truth somewhere in the middle of everything that you talk to everyone that you talk to. So
Yeah, I just wanted to hop in and talk a little bit about budgeting from my own personal perspective and on how I started tackling budgeting. Um, so for me, all of the everything that I've spent on Circus has come out of my own savings, and I think that is probably going to be the case for a lot of people starting out in indie.
Mhm.
Mhm.
So I did sit down. I think Ben was the one that mentioned this of just make a spreadsheet.
Yeah.
But I think sometimes people can get kind of intimidated with that. Which I mean, sometimes it's like, well, where do I start? What numbers do I look for? So something that I did was I knew that my film was going to clock in at around 40 minutes, and so 40 minutes times 60 seconds is 2,400 seconds for my film. And if I paid animators $40 a second, which is still pretty low, it's not an hourly rate, but if I paid them $40 a second for 2,400 seconds, that's $96,000 that it's going to cost me to do animation. And I was like, oh, that's a big number.
Mhm.
So then I started evaluating. I was like, okay, what can I do myself? What can I take on for the production? How can I potentially try to cut down some of this time? What do I have to plan for my Kickstarter down the line? What do I prioritize now instead? Maybe I shift over into prioritizing animation for a trailer to promote the Kickstarter later on. I think that really sitting down and kind of facing the music with how massive these numbers can be is
Mhm.
really it's a wake up call, and I think it's an important one to have earlier rather than
Yeah,
later. I
yeah.
think that oftentimes people will be like, oh, here we go, let's jump into it, and then they sink in, their savings, couple $1,000s, and they're like, hold on, this is actually really expensive, and they can't really manage
Mhm.
the rest of it. And because they're kind of halfway through, it's difficult for them to adjust the scope during rather than before.
Mhm.
So something that I have been doing is I'm tackling a significant amount of the boarding by myself, and I'm going to be doing a lot of the cleanup animation by myself. I think I am not much of an animator by trade, so I think that animation is still going to be a lot of my budgeting.
Mhm.
But I think that I really encourage people to really sit down with those numbers and be like, okay, this is a lot of money. And so what am I going to do about it? And not to be discouraged by it, but just to kind of face the reality of a project like this is going to be expensive, especially if it's long. Um,
Mhm.
very much, I feel like I'm very much in a do as I say, not as I do thing, because I probably shouldn't
Mhm.
have started with a 40-minute film. I encourage people to start a little bit smaller than that, but that's a good example of why, because $96,000 is a lot of money. So, when you look at that number, be like, okay, well, what can I cut? What can I adjust? How can I shift my scope around? And so, one of the songs that we have in Circus, we're thinking about doing a sort of shadow puppet motion graphic sort of style, which might save us on some time and money while still getting the idea across, but without it being traditionally 2D animated. So I think that it really sitting down with the the cold hard reality of budgeting, it can be a little bit discouraging, but it can also be empowering to explore, okay, well, this is the information that I have. How can I adjust it to fit what I can do? Maybe I don't have to hire a storyboarder. Maybe I can do it myself. Maybe I don't have to hire a cleanup artist. Maybe I can take that on. That's what I would recommend for people to.
Yeah.
I don't think that having that knowledge is a negative. I think knowledge is power, and it can allow you um, to be informed on how to continue. Those are my 2 cents.
And not for nothing, but a lot of projects also, they take a bit to get going. Where, yes, 96,000 is a really big number if you're looking at it to take on all at once. But if you're able to do a little bit of it at a time, that's also a completely valid way to run a project. There are some productions that I've seen that have, run a Kickstarter, raised a bunch of money, get super, super far in, and then realize, oh crap, we don't have enough, and then have to kind of go back around again.
Yep.
But what you can do is just take it in shifts where I have a certain amount after my work that I want to put towards this project. I'm gonna get some concept art made. I'm gonna do half of the storyboards for this episode. And that's a completely valid way to go about it because it doesn't have to be all at once. This can be a process. So don't let that
Yeah.
be the most overwhelming thing because you can do it. That's the cool thing about this process is once you have everything organized, it's just a matter of having the assets to continue with the plan slowly but surely.
I agree with Ben, and I just wanted to add that I think it's really important to, if you don't have the funds and you're trying to make a production, it's fine to wait until you have the funds to do it. Like, do not staff up before you try and make your project and you don't have any money to do so. It took me years to save up for the budget that I needed to have to make just the proof of concept, which is only like a minute and a half of fully animated content. But even then, it took years just to have the budget for a proof of concept. And I do think it is really important to understand the amount that you're going to need, and you can take your time to save up. But again, it's not a good idea to try and make a production before you have the money to do so.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Absolutely.
think it's super important. Like, this is one of the rules that I set for myself early on and working on this project is I never assign any tasks to anyone if I don't know it's something I can afford. And to do that, you have to make sure you have the funds for everything, or for at least a lot of things early on, or at least for the scope, for the scale of the project that you're working on, or the portion of the project you're working on. You have to have those funds set aside or ready before you start assigning those tasks out or hiring for those roles or anything of that sort. Last thing you want is to get into any sort of like an ethical situation as well with the budgeting.
Yeah, because not for
And
nothing, but these are going to be people that are working on this project with you, and this is a job to a lot of people. If you, the point we have an entire team, and there is an obligation to make sure you take care of them, if that's what you conveyed. If it's like we're going to do this whole thing all the way through, and then you realize, ooh, things are tight. It's like, what are you going to say to your team? Like,
right.
rug, be like, sorry. No.
Yeah, it's not quite, that's not really an option, right? So
Yeah.
Yeah, I think also, not to be contrary, I totally get what you're saying. I think it is okay to press pause. I think it is okay
right.
if you hit like the bottom of the barrel, it is okay to say, hey guys, let me pause on this for a second, because that has actually happened with me with Circus recently.
Yeah, but you make
I
sure you
was
communicate that with your team. That's all.
Yes, oh yes,
Yeah.
I agree. That's what I'm saying. I think that
Right.
you can save up. I saved up a lot of money for Circus, and I was like, okay, let's go. And I spent a lot of the budget that I had because I did a lot of really amazing work on our musical side of things. I'm really excited for it, but now I had to press pause because financial situations change, and there's absolutely no shame in that. And I
Right.
think oftentimes people who are working on your project are aware of that. So as long as you communicate it, there's no shame in it, and things change, and we're not a big mega corporation.
Yeah.
So as long as you're communicative with your team, if you need to press pause, if you need to reevaluate, like that's totally fine.
Yeah. I fully agree with that. And just to circle this back to the topic at hand with pipeline and such, this budgeting does actually directly influence what your pipeline looks like, right? I think Eddie mentioned this and Ahmad mentioned this as well, that like it directly impacts the scope of the project that you can take on, right? And so, and that ends up changing sort of the how you end up structuring the process that you're working with, how many people you're able to work with. Therefore, that changes how your pipeline is structured and such. And then one thing that I would just to really urge more indie creators to start thinking about, and I do worry that this is not happening often enough, is that not only should you plan for budgeting, you should also start considering how to plan to recoup that budget. Um, and in one way or another, if that is your goal. If your goal is to create something that is, something that sustains your career, then yeah, you should start to plan for how you want to recoup that budget, only because that will also alter your pipeline. If your goal is to, of course, make something that you've created and you're proud of and it's released to the world, this might not be as much of a consideration, and that's a very valid and okay way to go. If your goal is to create something that's more of a portfolio piece for yourself, or something that's more self-fulfillment driven than career and financial driven, then I mean, ideally you'd be doing both. If you are financially driven, you could also be creatively fulfilled at times. But I think if you're mostly driven creatively and less so financially, then maybe don't worry about the step. But if you are interested in making sure that you're able to sustain creating more episodes than just one, or creating a bigger season than just one and such, then do start to plan for how you're going to recoup some of that budget while you're working. Early on is a good idea to do so, because that actually alters in indie animation, it alters your pipeline as well. For us, for example, a big portion of how we intend to sort of move forward with our production and our project after our prologue season is dependent on several things, and one of them is content creation related and such. So if we didn't plan for that earlier or early at all, we wouldn't have been able to sort of create a structure that we have right now, in which during our weeks we regularly have times where content creation is either prepared for, recorded, or actually done live, and that alters when people can work in your pipeline as well, right? So
Kiki,
it's worth considering.
Kiki, we should definitely do a panel on monetization next year.
Mm-hmm.
Really good idea, Ed.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I would be down for that, and I think if you want to talk about monetizing on YouTube, there are certainly some YouTubers in our collective who would be interested in sharing their insights as well.
Also true.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
Ibrahim is an excellent point.
Yeah. It entirely changes your. I mean, I think Ben, you're starting a studio in which you have you might have clients and those sorts of things. For example, is a monetization route, right? And whereas others might be going more sort of crowdfunding and such. And there's all these different routes that you can go, and it's something that drastically alters the dynamic of the team and studio and the group of friends that are creating art that you're creating around yourself, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I would say, just jumping in very briefly, I think that it's also important to remember that there is never a guarantee of a return of budget. There's never a
Right.
guarantee of monetization. So I would encourage people to not go into indie seeking out that money ever coming back, because it may never. It's a rare thing. It's something that you can plan for, something you can hope for. But there is never really a guarantee that that budget is ever going to be made back from the project that you're making. But I think that is definitely like a bigger conversation, and it would be a really interesting
Right.
panel if we did that in the future.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, animation in general is far from a get-rich-quick scheme, and that should not be your intention, right? So you definitely, if you don't have the sort of the creative soul for it and the drive for it, that you're really passionate about this will burn you out very quickly. So the budgeting and the finances and stuff like that can be very overwhelming if that's if the goal is not exclusively financial. So yeah, Eddie's totally right. It's not a guaranteed return. You have to really love this at times.
So we have our script. You have your storyboards for your script.
Mhm.
We have a budget document that you're starting to actually put things into based on how many shots you're going to need. So around 15 to 20 maybe per page. Next part of your thing you have to figure out. And the pipeline is probably, well, I mean, getting character designs finalized. That's another pre-production thing. Model sheets and turnarounds, because once you get into animation, it's going to be pretty vital unless you don't care how your project is going to look and every single frame can be a totally different image, which stylistically could be interesting, but for the most part, you have a look you want for your characters and you want things to be consistent for the most part. So, getting model sheets for your characters, you can actually refer to them in the animation, is going to be a pretty important part of pre production. Well, also, explorations for that final style for when you get into post. What is an example of how you want things to ultimately look? And what is going to go into achieving that style? Are you going to have to do like matte paintings and like very detailed like blending work over like black and white layouts of backgrounds? Are you going to have to be an insane person and just go full like powerhouse and do 3D modeling for all of your backgrounds? Figuring out sort of what the assets are going to be to get that stylish show is important, and concept art sketches can help a lot for that, and you want to know that going out the gate. So yeah, figuring out your sort of character art and the style of the visuals.
Mhm.
I think that
Yeah.
knowing the style that you're going for also will affect your budget.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
I think that if you're going for something that is really clean, you'll have to budget in, a cleanup crew.
Mm-hmm.
Or if you're doing rig animation, you have to budget in building the rigs first, but then you don't have to budget for cleanup because that's already built in. I think that knowing all of that stuff ahead of time really helps with kind of the planning of kind of knowing exactly what your end product is going to look like. That also helps with making sure that you have a clear vision of what you're budgeting for as well.
Mhm.
Yeah.
A lot of this information is available online if you want to look it up, or finding
Mhm.
books on animation or any part of the process, or just asking people you know that might be knowledgeable, but vital to figure it out. And I would say getting the models for your character, whether you're doing more traditional 2D animation or building rigs, that's definitely important step of pre-production. So make sure you budget your time and your assets for
Mhm.
that accordingly.
Mhm.
Um, and then from that part, I suppose you could just move on to, well, I guess what we typically do in that point is once we have our storyboards, we tend to try to get like our scratch tracks, because when you do rough animation, you're going to be using your storyboard sometimes. Sometimes you'll use them as like a basis for your keyframes, where like the shots you have in your storyboards are relatively close and you just need to clean them up and put them in the correct style and on model. Sometimes you might want to change it, but in terms of getting the right timings for your animation, it's pretty vital to work with a scratch track, at least for our
Mhm.
process. So that usually involves, at that point, finding voice actors, bringing folks on board to make sure you're recording all your lines, and cutting together a really rough, basically audio file of just the people talking at that point. And from that, you
Mhm.
can sort of place that maybe with the storyboards you've made already, and you make a little animatic to figure out your times. In terms of how budgeting impacts that, I would say industry standard on like the very low end, because I see a lot of people, you can do like, $5 per line if it's like a really short project. Some people do like, indie rates are a thing. And some folks are more interested in filling their portfolio. But in terms of like industry level folks that work on like AAA games or anime, like more higher tier voice actors, I would say to probably start. I mean, usually what we do is like 200 or 250 an hour. If you have a 30-minute project, for the most part, you were probably able to get all of the voice lines you need for a character if you keep your, directing sessions pretty organized and, timed well. But cutting together that's going to be an important part of pre-production, and figuring out what your budget for voice acting is and getting casting done is an important thing to focus on too.
Mhm.
I don't want to just be talking too much. I apologize. I just feel like there's
No,
a
it's good
lot.
info though. Good info, yeah.
I would say on the subject of budgeting for a voice actor,
Mm.
just for I guess transparency of people trying to plan. My voice actors were paid $250 per hour for a minimum of 2 hours. That seemed to be sort of the standard that I worked with.
Yeah, 250.
And uh, it, and there are some people that are willing to do lower, and I think that is your choice if you would like to, but I also encourage people, if you can, try to budget and plan for paying people a fair indie rate. I would encourage you to do so. I had a wonderful experience with the voice actors that I worked with, and making sure that I put aside a fair rate so that they would feel appreciated was really important to me.
And not
Yeah,
even
and-
just that, but the amount, like the kind of auditions you're going to receive if you're doing well under minimum wage versus offering a rate that most, voice over artists are going to be familiar with, you're going to be seeing a very different quality in your voice actors. Not for nothing. But the people that do this for a living and are excellent at it will want to work on projects where there's usually like a reason for their work.
Yeah,
I
and
would
if you want
I would even say that even people who aren't doing it for a living, if they are doing it for a hobby, I'm not saying that this is what you're saying, but I encourage people to
Just use
even
the
pay
industry
people.
standard for the payments.
Yeah, what I'm trying to say is, even if they don't do it for a living, if they're not the best, I think that they are still kind of deserving of a fair wage. I think that I've seen a few indie things that are like, well, we're looking for inexperienced people so that we can pay them less, which was kind of questionable
Well,
for
that
me.
shouldn't be the goal. You should pay them what you're able to pay them, and then
Yeah.
whoever comes to that is going to be who you get.
Mhm.
And if you're curious about what industry standard rates are, even if you're not a SAG-AFTRA production, there is the SAG-AFTRA pay scale is out there publicly. If you just search SAG-AFTRA new media rates, and you'll see sort of the rates based on budget scales. So depending on what your production budget is at, you can take a look at that and see what the day rates or the hourly rates usually are, and you can sort of scale and adjust from there. I think it's usually a good starting point. For me, among the others, my show is a SAG-AFTRA production, so we do use the SAG-AFTRA rates for our projects. But I find that they're very fair even to indie production, especially if you're looking at the new media rates, not the TV rates. The TV rates would be too high for most of us, but
Yeah,
the new media
new-
rates for sure are reasonable.
New media
It
or
is
possibly
doable.
micro
Yeah.
budget, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so
It-
there's a few different things that could apply.
It
Yeah.
is doable to make your production a union production, but definitely do your research on what makes the most sense for the scale of what you're trying to do.
Right. I would not recommend making your project a union project if you're not sure what the benefits of it are for you as well, or
Yeah.
for your cast or staff. So
Like if you're
Yeah.
doing even like a short animation where like I want to make a Newgrounds Flash, like a thing for Pokemon that I really love, and it's gonna be 8 minutes long. You probably don't need to like figure out the SAG-AFTRA pay scale to like an extreme way and make that a union production. If it's like
right.
figure out what makes sense for you.
I would say, so I actually did consider registering Circus with SAG. It didn't quite make sense for the project that I was doing, but I saw some really positive responses when I said that I was doing a like a SAG competitive rate. So when I expressed, hey, I'm aware of this sort of thing, I'm looking for something, I'm looking to pay someone this higher rate, and being kind of aware of it, I got a lot of interest from professional people that were like, "Oh, cool. I see what you're doing, and I respect that you are at least aware of like the rates that we should be given as voice actors." So even if you don't unionize, I think that saying that you're like, oh, I'm aware of the rate and I'm willing to pay it even if we're not unionized, I think is still a positive for your production.
Right.
So you figured out how you're going to be getting the budget for your voice actors, you've recorded all your lines, and you're cutting together a scratch track and making an animatic based on boards. The next stage for that would be rough animation, and that is a process that's going to take much longer than you sometimes will think, especially if it's been your first project on stuff. Again, that's a sort of situation to do your spreadsheets, make sure you're communicating with the folks you're working with, and divvy up your shots. I think Kiki was saying we should probably get into a little bit of the general management, and I think that's a perfect place to do that, probably, because we're
Yeah,
kind of
let's do
talking
it.
about as it gets into general production, because at the point you're doing your roughs, we're not really in pre-pro anymore.
Hmm. Yeah, and just to be, oh, hello, did something happen? I thought I heard an oh no somewhere.
All right,
I thought I heard oh no from you.
No,
oh, let's
Anyways,
let's
go.
go.
I was like, oh my goodness, I'm panicking. Anyways, yeah, but we should just be careful too, in the sense that not every production has to do rough animation. And I guess in some ways we have to, but for example, for my production with Motion Story, we don't have rough animation. We just have illustrations being created, and then a lot of our animation basically gets done in post production. It's in this weird limbo in between phase. Or if you're doing sort of uh, um,
Puppet
3D
play.
animation, so on and so forth. There's or puppet animation. A lot of the processes are just a little bit different, and so for everybody, the steps during production will be different. But it's generally the principles of how to manage it should be universal. I think the things that we'll discuss should be generally universal in that sense, at least. So I guess with that, just wanted to have that be something that you guys as the audience are aware of, so that you're not feeling like this is exclusively 2D traditional animation centric.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Everything
it
that's going to be
also
said has a million caveats.
Right, exactly.
it also changes if you are doing rig animation as well or 3D animation.
Mhm.
Depending on what your medium of choice is, it's going to change what production or pre-production means. So I think a lot of that probably comes from do your research on what you're tackling for sure.
Right.
I have done some research into rig animation, and it is a totally different pipeline. It's a totally different thing that you have to plan for, and plan for troubleshooting and rig building and all these things. So it definitely I get what you're saying. It totally depends on kind of what your medium of choice is for your project.
And yeah. So in terms of just organizing it and actually like general pipeline management, I think probably Eddie might have something specific to say on this as well, just in terms of sort of like the waterfall production schedule, where the most efficient way and how a lot of studios will sort of run their stuff is they'll have basically each bit of work feed into the next stage of like the process. And if you're working with a larger team, it tends to be, once the boards are done and things are kind of locked away, you can basically start, folks working on rough animation. And then once one shot is done, it can be basically moved to someone who's working in line art on this. And then the person who's working line art, when they finish that, they can hand it to the person who's doing like flat colors or whoever be doing the final comp for a shot. Well, final comp is probably something that should be done like all at once near the end, more than likely. But just
Real
the
quick.
idea of, I mean, there's different ways to go about it. Again, that's one of the cool things about indie. But just the waterfall rolling schedule of, and then if you have each people, because what Maud was saying before, in figuring out kind of like what your roles are going to be, what is the most efficient thing for a person to work on, and figuring out how you're divvying things up. Once you start the process, you can basically have just like folks on the team working on just the roughs. When that's done, you move it to the next, so no one's really waiting on the next person as much because it just kind of goes down the line like a cascading waterfall.
Yeah, it's just dawning on me right now that have we defined what pipeline means in the context of the discussion for our audience yet? We might have, but I feel like I might have blinked on it.
I think
Well,
we discussed what post production means. I don't think we talked about a pipeline.
well, I mean, I guess we could. I think that
I feel like I should just generally self-explanatory for us in this sense, but I think for me, I'm when I'm talking about the pipeline, I'm talking about sort of how your sort of like studio or your project's infrastructure is working from step to step to step, essentially, or from how overall communication is happening, so on and so forth.
Oh, so you want to
Um,
talk more like back end, like how you're actually like basically sending shots over, how you're actually organizing that with just
Yeah,
sort
I think it'd be useful just for people to know sort of the how to manage that side of it and how to have it run through the pipeline and so on and so forth. But I'm just sort of curious what context for this conversation makes the most sense.
No, I think that's a completely great thing to touch upon as well. It actually might
Mhm.
make more sense to jump into that before the rest of it. I mean, the way our team works is we basically have like a work server that we all sort of check in on. Assignments are sort of divvied up and sent out on there. And during the day, when we're working on stuff, we're able to kind of hop in a voice call if we want to have, folks have another set of eyes on a shot or try to figure out something with whatever software we're kind of working with, whether that's Toon Boom or CSP if we're working on a project that's just for illustrations. Really just figuring out the best way to communicate, guarding the work. Discord's probably just a good friend there. Some people will use like Slack,
Mhm.
but again, you have a lot of flexibility for that. Making just a good Discord server to communicate with your team is a pretty effective way to do that, I'd say. If anyone like has, other thoughts on that, I mean, I just feel like that's what works for us, and for most
Yeah,
people,
yeah,
they're already familiar with that as a service, so.
right, right. Well, yeah, Mon and Eddie, what do you guys do for managing this whole pipeline and all that for you guys?
Oh,
I'm
so.
curious.
Oh, Maud,
no,
you
go
go
ahead.
first. No, you haven't
No,
talked in a
you
bit.
go. I'm just kidding.
So
Look
polite.
at you. Yeah. So again, when we first started working as like the four of us before we really expanded, it was like just three to four people in like a little Discord group chat, and then we're like, all right, guys, let's get the day started. But then we just start working in the same old Discord call for hours, getting our work done. But as things sort of have progressed, definitely like it's still been like a mix and match, and it depends on like what projects we're on and what productions we've been in. Discord, I guess, would be good for like startups and like smaller teams. Like I've seen some pretty solid productions being hosted in a Discord. Slack is also good. Trello is also good for management and tracking. Notion, and I
Notion's
think if you really Notion's good, yeah. If you really want to get fancy with it, Google Network is probably like a really strong contender if you really want to like keep things organized and like keep everything in one place. It's good for like file organization too. Like if you want to pay for like the Google Network and like the drives and like all like the amount of files that people can have and like drop off. Um, and of course it also hosts things like meetings and calls. Um, so there's definitely different options depending on what resources that you have access to.
And that actually
Mhm.
dovetails pretty perfectly into another thing, how you're going to be physically moving the files. Because unless you've decided, I'm going to do a fully hand-drawn animation, just like the old masters, one, please reconsider.
All right,
But
Eddie.
yeah. But yeah, a file storage system is going to be pretty much your best friend. Google Drive is a pretty solid one. Some folks prefer Dropbox. Basically, any kind of thing that you're more than likely going to want to put in a little bit of funds towards, and that should be part of your budget as well, to get kind of more storage for Google Drive, because these files are going to get big. A lot of the projects we're working on, there'll be many iterations of it. If it's important to you to keep old versions, which personally I do think is an important thing because you never know when you're going to need an old version of something to go back and refer to during your process. But yeah, just making sure everything is squared away in there. what you're able to do is if folks are working on assignments, you can have people upload sort of different things into your folders regarding like, this is for scene 1, these are storyboards, these are animation sections. Make sure you have a good labeling system and resist the urge to do as of dvd.mp4 for everything because you'll want to die later pretty easily.
Okay.
So something even boring like SC1, SH1, scene 1, shot 1, to just sort of make it easier for yourselves, but just make a little, a couple folders in a Google Drive, start organizing stuff in there, and when people need to access project files, they can download it from there and work on it on their own, computer if you're doing things remotely, which a lot of indie is probably all of us working remotely with people around this world. But yeah, it's just an easy thing to sort of pass files back and forth and not have it be a nightmare every.
Yeah. Kind of doubling back a little bit because I wanted to pick up of kind of Maud's example on how I'm structuring my project. Just before we get too far down the I guess the file organization topic, I am in a little bit of a different position than a few of us in this call, where it sounds like a lot of folks have like a dedicated team that is already on the project. I am on a pretty limited budget, and I'm pre like crowdfunding. So a lot of the people that I work with is really on a freelance basis where I have them on as I need them, and I can't really guarantee them like a lot of shots in a row. So the way that I have been organizing has been through a Discord and has been through Discord DMs, which maybe for some people that is a little bit disorganized because it's a lot of DMs to keep track of. But you don't always need to have everybody all in like one workspace if you can't necessarily provide them a whole lot of work. Because my project is a little bit more in its early stages at this point with funding, and I primarily use Google folders to share files with folks, and I keep it organized on my computer. Once I have a crowdfund and I will have a larger team that I have to keep organized, that will definitely change. I think I'll probably utilize the Discord and the Google Drive a little bit more so that people can go in and grab shots as they're needed. But I think that it's also something important to share for smaller indie productions or indie productions that don't have as big of a budget to have a full team. I think it's also okay to structure your project on almost like a freelance commission basis, where I'll be reaching out to some of my animators and I'll say, can you do this one shot because I can afford this one shot right now, or can you do this one thing of concept art for me? And it'll be here and there as I can afford it. And I think that's also an okay way to structure it. You don't have to have a massive team right at the start. I think it's okay to instead of focusing on a big chat or something like that, keeping yourself organized and knowing what you can afford and what you're capable of, I think is also a way that you can kind of structure your project if that works for you.
Because like we're saying, it's a big process. No one's gonna be handling it necessarily the same way, and it is completely fine to start at the scale that makes sense for you. And as long as you are keeping focused and making sure this is structured and you're not overextending, then yeah, it's completely valid to handle it like that. You can stop and start when you need. Make sure you're communicating with your team.
Absolutely. I think. Oh, go ahead, Maud.
Oh no, sorry. I was gonna add. Regardless of the size, please use spreadsheets. Please, it's so useful.
Wait, are we back to file organization? Because yes, Google Sheets is gonna be your friend for a lot of things.
Yeah. We've gotten pretty I wouldn't say high tech with our Google Sheets, but we definitely make use of the features that it has and all this sort of stuff to keep things organized. For our project, we use Jira for a lot of our stuff. I know that's mostly common in sort of the tech world and less so in the arts world, but that was just the background that I came from, so I knew sort of how to run it. It's very similar to Trello in a lot of ways. And but basically allows us to move tasks to different stages of completion. So whether it's in our to-do list or if it's in progress, if it needs revisions, if it's in peer review, if it's being reviewed by the director, and then eventually finally being done, all those different states of each task is tracked, and everyone in our team can move each of those tasks into each of those swim lanes, so they can all have a visual indication of where the project is at. And as those things move to different parts of the Jira swim lane, I guess, or the board, I guess, it will update our shot list to indicate to us what's been done in our shot list and stuff like that as well. Which that on its own is a Google spreadsheet that we use. So
I also want to hop in if we're talking about organizational software that's helpful. At my job, we used ShotGrid, which is also worth looking into. It is a little expensive, but it is really, really helpful. And I don't see a lot of indie projects utilizing it. I think it would be really cool to have a ShotGrid for my film a little bit down the line. I think that's a great way to stay organized, and it was pretty helpful as a database to find like character references and shots and things like that. So
ShotGrid certainly. Yeah, Shocker looks incredible. It's something that's our team has considered as well. So might be a future thing for us. There's also other tools and such coming out nowadays for particularly for remote and collaborative artistic stuff. Just use the tech that's available out there to your disposal to make things run smoothly.
The way that I check a shot completion for my project is I shake up a magic 8-ball, and then it tells me if it's done or not.
But I will say,
sorry.
I was just gonna say, I think that your best friend on any indie production is a well-organized shot list. Yeah. Please make a really organized shot list to know exactly what needs to be made when, because that will save you so much headache down the line, knowing what's been done and what needs to be made still. I think that once you've done all the boards, put those into a shot list and make sure you know exactly what you need, because it will help you a lot.
Yeah,
you're gonna run into a lot of headaches if you don't.
Sorry.
All right, go on, Ben. Yeah.
No, I was just gonna say a really low-tech, basic way to do things just in a Google Sheet. You have your category of your thumbnail. That's the image that, like, literally they just said. You put the little thing there so you know what it is. A shot description about kind of what you're going to be seeing in that. And you can mark, like, where on the pipeline it is, any notes about the shot. And then you have all of your categories for animation, cleanup, flats, render, and comp work. And you can just have a red if it's not finished, yellow if it's started, and green if it's done. And just make sure you can visually see it, because that is a helpful thing too, like they were mentioning before. But yeah, just low-tech version of it can work, but definitely look into stuff like ShotGrid.
Yeah.
And now we have 10 minutes to talk about post-production, which is what we were trying not to do.
I think we were talking about post-production, right? I think it's Q&A, right?
Oh no! I thought we were talking about post-production. I thought Q&A was at 8:30. Okay, so we have time.
Now we got to kick you out. Sorry, Ben.
Yeah. We gave you a chance.
I have no idea what's happening, but we should definitely talk about post before we have to shift to Q&A.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, for us, post-production is managed much the same way that everything else is managed in our pipeline, with Jira mostly, and we communicate about notes often either in our Discord, or we leave comments in the Jira ticket so that everything stays organized, so people can see what notes associate with what tasks, so that they don't have to fish through them through Discord. And then since I do a lot of the post-production audio on my project, or in fact, at the moment I'm doing all of it, the organization for that is I do it, and that's it. It just sort of happens. And sometimes that's what it is,
For my production, it is me. I'm just the only compositor right now on the team. But for stuff for like bigger teams, when you're doing when you have multiple compositors on, it is good to have references for your team and how they can actually access files. Because for me, I'm the one who's getting all the files, but if you have a team of compositors, knowing where all the files are, having that spreadsheet, having that tracker is really, really good. But also, if you're doing things like you have to have the same exact look across every single shot, and you have different compositors working in similar sequences, you want to make sure that those are consistent. So people do stuff like presets, like drag and drop presets into an After Effects file. Sometimes, this is my preference, you just build a shot in a sequence, and then that's the reference that everybody working in that sequence will use. Or if you like really want to get fancy with it, you have one big file with like your character assets, and then like you have like a background representing every sequence in your episode or your pilot or proof of concept, and you can just flip through the comps to see like, okay, this is the comp treatment for this sequence, and this is a comp treatment for that sequence. Either that or just having a guide. Just like, all right, we put this level layer on this, and then we have this adjustment layer here. Just having those references for the compositing team is really, really helpful.
Yeah, we went the After Effects file route for us. Me and Julie, our motion story artist, who also does her compositing at the moment, sat down and just looked through a After Effects file that I put together as our test composite, and we sort of ran from that.
Oh, nice.
And ran for that. So, but yeah, just have some way to communicate. And this is, I think, true for really any step of the process, regardless of whether it's compositing or anything else. Have your guides ready. We've had to put together almost retroactively like character style guides and environment style guides and so on and so forth, because as the team has grown, it's increasingly important that we can communicate how to do what we do clearly. Because, no matter how much you try to hire for style, there's always going to be variations here and there.
I will say that on the subject of post, I used to do work on an indie project in the compositing department, and I'm trying to find a way to say this without sounding silly, but please have mercy on your compositor, and if you can, consider compositing when you're in the animation stage and the background stage as well. Considering how to make things a little bit easier for your post-production team will help a lot. Because I think, Maud, earlier you mentioned that so much of compositing is problem solving, and there would be less problems if like at the beginning there was a consideration of like, oh, maybe I should finish drawing this character's arm so that we don't have to make it in post-production because we wanted to zoom out the shot in this specific area, or whatever it ends up being.
Or drawing a bunch of shading instead of just doing flat colors, and then if you have the lighting come from literally anywhere else in the final comp, it's not going to make any sense.
Yeah,
just comp on CapCut, guys.
Right, yeah. Just make it easier.
Leave this place and do not return, my god. We only use iMovie for editing here, Maud. We have
sorry, I gotta quit my job.
We got Venetian blinds. We got everything.
Yeah, but I think that considering what your post-production team, what their workload is going to look like, and saying, oh well, I can extend this background a little bit, or I can consider how I can make it easier for the post-production team, I think is always going to be, it'll save you time, it'll save you money, because so much of compositing is just like, how do I fix this?
Oh god, we had someone ask about timesheets. That's definitely like a traditional like sample, like for larger studios, kind of what they do, because there's a lot of passing around files at that level, sometimes to like teams from like different countries. I think this was Magic Lux Studios in chat was asking that.
Yeah, timesheets. I learned that in film school, and I'll be honest, I did not process any of it. There's definitely some resources out there that can help teach you. I think a lot of it comes from practice, and I did not put in the practice to educate someone about it. But there are some resources, and it can be helpful if you are splitting up your team into keyframe animators and in between animators. So if there is a certain idea of how to do the timing for that, and you want to pass that on to an in-betweener, and making those notations could be helpful. It could be worth looking into. I think Ben is right that it is more of a thing that kind of comes from shipping overseas and communicating the timing that you're looking for the animation.
Yeah,
Um,
we found for the most part, because we do everything in-house with us, we generally know and we're able to communicate with each other, sort of like what our timings are, and the scratch track really helps with most of that. And it just sort of based on what we're already doing. So I can't speak too much more to that, unfortunately.
mhm.
Out with just one question tonight. I saw one that I really liked and I'm curious to know the answer for. And that was from, I think, Haryana Hook. How often during pre-production or like early production did your art style change as you guys were developing your series or movies?
It happened a lot for us.
Our team.
Ours was very. Oh, go ahead.
No, please.
Oh no, I was just gonna say ours was like scarily consistent. I think we made the designs. They're like, yeah, that's it. We're sticking with that one.
Yeah, basically similar here. Like I answered this in the chat with Haryana. It's just excellent question. Just we did like a few explorations, but we kind of knew what we wanted to do, like setting out for our oceanic bastard man. So it was pretty much we knew from the beginning. But that's really where you make those changes. Because if you're like, I don't like anything about this art style now, and you've done half of your roughs, like, please reconsider.
Mhm. Yeah, for Circus has been fairly consistent because it's just my art style. I'm not necessarily working on a big team that has a lot of uh, differing art styles. Something um, that did change, however, is I did work with some character designers who helped me to streamline my style for animation. I think for a lot of indie creators, a lot of us are kind of just like, these are my babies, these are my OC. I don't want to change anything about them. But being open to working with someone who is informed on how to simplify a design for animation is a really important step that I think that sometimes people skip over because those are your OCs. You don't want to change them. My style was a little bit too detailed and a little bit too many lines here and there that would just be too hard to keep track of. So working with people who helped me to streamline and to redesign a few details was actually really helpful. It is still stylistically my style and things that a certain look that I'm going for, but I think something to consider is not necessarily changing your style, but considering how that moves in animation and how many details and colors that you need per character.
Yeah, I think in contrast to sort of most of you guys, our style for Among the Others changed a lot early on. For I think several reasons. One main reason though was that I think I was learning what it took to sort of direct animation and then sort of direct that and have discussions around sort of how a character should be designed and how you would want them to look and how a character design sort of conveys the style and the tone of the show and so on and so forth. Those were things that were not only new to me, but I think my team as a whole, we were all sort of new to working at this capacity and trying to put together a show and such. So there was a lot of learning that had to happen. We had to get increasingly sort of more vigilant about line mileage, and we had to sort of learn about how we want to communicate about the style and how we want to define it. How did we transform from reference to actually the style that is actually our show now? How do we go from turning our references into our own unique style and such? And all those things I think were things that were a learning experience for us. And that's where I think when we're talking about budgeting earlier, that's part of the reason that I do mention things like leaving a little bit of extra funds as a just in case measure, especially if you're newer to directing a show, or you yourself are not one of the artists on the production. You might be coming at it from a writing or a music perspective or whatever. Those might be some things that you're going to need to iterate on until you figure it out. So yeah, our show definitely went through some style changes. And honestly, I think our show continues to sort of evolve here and there depending on the needs of our project and the budget here at times. So, but for the most part, once you hit production and such, it's definitely locked. So that's when it can change. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say don't be afraid of your style changing and stuff like that. Oftentimes, it's for the better. I'm actually very happy with how the project has changed. So over time for my show, and plus, every time you hire people to the team and your team grows, everyone pluses it in all these unique ways and makes it their own in these unique ways. And, like our show style used to be very distinctly Lexi, our lead character artist style, and then Carmen, our character colorist, has started joined the project, and they've started to really level up how we do coloring and in turn how the compositing has worked in the end as well. And those things level up the style of the show over time. And I think for us, that's okay. We actually sort of appreciate those improvements that we couldn't have foreseen needed to be needed.
Mm-hmm.
What a great question. Thank you so much,
Yeah,
Ariana.
that was an awesome question. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, I love that question. Great. Well, thank you guys so much for dispensing all of your knowledge today and doing a fantastic final panel for our 2023 Indie Animation How-To series. I think we now have a little toolkit for our listeners and our audience for how to get started. If you enjoyed this panel series, we are looking at doing some deep dive panels in 2024 on specific topics within the animation sphere, specifically the indie animation sphere. For example, a deep dive panel with some demonstrations on compositing. We are also looking at doing some panels on video essay writing and production as well. So please subscribe to the Hub channel if that's something that interests you, and we'll be seeing ya. Can we have everybody just do a sign off and a little self promote real quick before we go?
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah.
Abraham first.
Who wants to start? Oh my goodness, me? Why me? Why me? Okay. Thanks for coming, guys. I really appreciate you guys checking us out and listening to us talk about what we're passionate about and seemingly what you guys are passionate about. And if you guys are curious about what I'm working on, my animated show is called Among the Others. It's at ATO the show everywhere on all social media. And we have some pretty exciting things that we have on the horizon that you should keep an eye out for. We've been silent fairly intentionally for the past few months, so I'm excited to start to not be silent anymore. So, but to have you guys follow us and check us out.
Yeah, no, we are Adventure Noises everywhere. It's always appreciated when we get to do this. Everyone is just so excited, and it's just wonderful to help people figure out the best way to kind of go about this. Our series project is Marabelli, A Scoundrel's Tale, but Adventure Noises does a lot of work on a lot of other projects as well. If you see a lot of indie stuff kind of out and about, there's a decent chance we've actually been working on that too. So we always appreciate when folks will follow us on YouTube. We're almost at 1K. Twitter, we're almost at 3K. TikTok, we're almost at 50K. It's been a weird smattering of social medias. It's weird. But it's always appreciated when folks can help us, especially on YouTube. That does a lot of good for us. And also, shameless promo here. If people do like little horrible gremlin clinging on to our logo, we actually do have plushies that we've made.
Awesome.
Little
That's so
shark
cool.
peeps plushies. They are shark teddy bears. Basically, imagine a little shark. He's got little teddy bear feet, and we have plushies made. So you can check out what we do and also our merch stuff on our studio site, which is adventurenoises.com. And yeah, Kiki, thank you so much for having us. It's always great to be here, and I'm looking forward to doing more of these in 2024.
I'm looking forward to it too, and it's a pleasure to know you guys and learn from you. All right, Maud.
Yeah, Thank you so much for coming, everyone. Just to go over things, I'm Maud. I'm the co-creator of Capapon, or one of the co-creators, and directing and producing Hearts of Titan. We are most active on Instagram, so please check us out. We just hit 66K there. But you can also find us on Twitter, Tumblr, and probably TikTok on Capapon Studios. We are trying to post more often, I swear, but we also have really cool things coming along. Really cool people all at this panel. I consider them all my friends, and they're all really cool. So go check out the work too.
Aw, same to you. Oh my god.
Thank you, Mom.
I'm having a wholesome tear shed right now.
Just the one. I have one.
Just a singular one. I don't have any more to give.
All right, and last but definitely not least, Eddie.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I want to say thank you, Kiki, so much for organizing this panel and all the panels that came before it. This has been such an amazing experience. So my film, again, is Circus of Wishes. You can find us at Circus of Wishes on Twitter, and Instagram is where we're most actively posting. We post every single Wednesday. So for Circus of Wishes Wednesday, there's always going to be an update of maybe a storyboard panel, or today we posted a little snippet of our script. So if you're curious about the behind the scenes of our project as we work on it, you can see updates every single week. You can also find me at edmeadart everywhere. And if anyone ever has any questions about indie animation or anything that we talked about here with pipeline management or anything like that, please feel free to reach out. I'm more than happy to help if anybody has any questions. But yeah, again, thank you so much, Kiki, for organizing this, and this was so much fun.
Yay,
Huge
thank you all
shout
for
out to the
being
Animation
here.
Appreciation.
Yep.
Animation Appreciation Hub is to be appreciated. You guys are awesome. So thanks so much, Keeks, for putting this together.
Shit, you guys are part of it, so that means you're awesome. But I think you're awesome anyways, regardless.
No way!
Oh shoot!
If
Wow.
you're watching this
Oh,
stream
man.
after we were live, feel free to send your questions for our panelists in the comments, and I will let them know to come over here and respond to you guys. With that being said, thank you so much for attending this panel series, everybody, and we are going to sign off. So everybody say bye!
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, stay around. Have a good
Have a good
day.
night.